Welcome to the Accessible Learning Experience, where we help you turn learning barriers into learning opportunities. In part 2 of our 3-part series focusing on the history of accessibility at CAS, CAS co-founder Skip Stahl picks up the story in the mid-1990s, when CAS becomes more involved in the world of policy in order to have a broader impact with initiatives such as the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standard, or NIMAS. Skip and David speak to the consensus building and collaboration that was needed to bring a range of stakeholders to the table in order to have these efforts, which continue to have a significant impact to this very day, be successful. Here's AIM Center Director Cynthia Curry with part 2 of our conversation with CAS co-founders Skip Stahl and David Rose.
Skip, when CAS developed UDL, one of the linchpins was to provide multiple representations of information for learners, including educational materials. At that time, which was before the widespread adoption of classroom technology, a one-size-fits-all curriculum of primarily print materials was the norm. Tell us about how materials were being adapted at that time and ultimately the evolution of what became the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standard.
David had mentioned pioneers and our work with individual students who were struggling because of sensory, physical, attentional, cognitive learning challenges. We were applying technology in many ways to individuals like a prosthetic to extend their capabilities in ways that they would be impossible for them to achieve otherwise. And as we did that work, we learned, we changed our orientation, began to develop a sense that it was a one-size-fits-all curriculum and the materials associated with it that were the major problem. And so we began to do conference presentations and began to be contacted by local school districts who wanted to gain from our knowledge and the work that we were doing. And towards the late 80s and emerging into the middle 90s, we did more outreach, professional development outreach, conference presentation outreach. And as we did that work, we began to discover that something was happening new in classrooms and schools around the country, and this was predominantly in kindergarten through senior year of high school. So we were working in K-12 settings for the most part. And what was triggering some of that change was desktop computer technology was getting more efficient, more powerful, and more economical. And in particular, the capability of actually scanning print pages, textbook pages, mimeograph sheets, etc., scanning those with a flatbed scanner and changing them into a digital version that could be manipulated. That technology became economically accessible to a variety of schools. And so in many cases, those of us who are out doing a lot of either presentations or professional development realized that in many circumstances, the same textbook might be being scanned in a library or a classroom in order to make it accessible as a digital version, might simultaneously be being scanned in 1,000 classrooms across the country because students who needed to have a Braille version, if the version was digital, could be readily translated page by page into Braille for that student in a just-in-time mode because national and local regional production, large-scale Braille production was still and continues to be quite slow and costly. And it occurred to us that there needed to be, that this was an incredible amount of redundancy, a lot of wasted time and effort, and that the efforts to create accessible versions were falling on the people who actually were the customers as opposed to the producers. At the same time, so we were seeing an uptick in the adoption of desktop scanning technology at the local school level, either classroom or library. At the same time, publishers were being requested to submit various digital formats for the production, primarily for the production of Braille, in about half the states in the country. So what we were hearing from the publishing community was that they might be requested to produce a certain type of structured rich text format or RTF file for one state, or ASCII, ASCII text, plain text format for another state, or a Microsoft Word document for the third state, or all three. And each of those productions of alternate formats, digital formats, was costing a publisher somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 every time they had to make that production. Because keep in mind, the curriculum publisher's workflow at that time was print and not digital. It was designed to actually publish. The final product was going to be print, so it was all oriented towards print production. So producing a digital format for distribution was a side endeavor that they often hired a third-party entity to do, working with their own files. So it was incredibly cost prohibitive every time a state asked for another format, and some states would ask for multiple formats. So here you had these two different populations. You had the consumers who were struggling to acquire accessible materials on the one hand, and doing it on an ad hoc basis, locality by locality. And then you had the producers, the very producers of the same materials, who were struggling with exactly the same problem on a large scale situation, and none of those entities were really talking with one another. And out of that, blind low vision advocacy organizations, a group of kind of a coalesced group of advocates for blind low vision, created a solutions forum that involved a lot of entities to try and come up with some national approach that would eliminate the redundancy, that would address the publisher's concerns, that would address the customer concerns. So those of us who were doing professional development from CAST around what we had learned in the labs, we were existing within this kind of confluence of concern that was growing at a national level. In the mid 90s, I was working with the Concord, New Hampshire School District. They had built a school-based network that all their schools and classrooms were connected with a wired computer network, which was astounding at that period of time because it just didn't exist elsewhere. And they had a vision that they could digitize in their libraries textbooks for students with disabilities who needed these under both special education and civil rights law as qualified learners who had special needs, that they could create an economy of scale using their network and create a repository of accessible instructional materials, and that they would and then teachers could request that those materials be downloaded via the network to local computers for students to be able to use. So for a period of about 4 or 5 years, I was consulting with that district as they put considerable energy and expertise into creating a centralized solution. And even though it was glitchy at times and not perfect and slow and errors occurred, et cetera, this centralized approach was the solution that was needed, and that we needed to expand this approach to a national model. And at the very same time, CAST, again under the direction and expertise of Chuck Hitchcock, was exploring applying for a federal grant. There was a federal competition out of the Office of Special Education Programs, U.S. Department of Education, that was entitled something like the National Center on Accessing the General Curriculum. And that title immediately attracted us and said, oh, here's a funding opportunity of the U.S. Department of Education is paying attention to what's going on in the country. They're paying attention to the blind low vision advocacy groups that are formed an active coalition. They're paying attention to publishers who are complaining to the U.S. Department of Education that there's no commercial value to the publishers to create Braille, and yet they're having to produce all these alternate files that are costing money, and can't the federal government do something? And then they're hearing complaints from consumers and customers in classrooms. CAST applied for the National Center on Accessing the General Curriculum, or NCAC, as we subsequently refer to it, and won that competition. It was our first major federal grant. Chuck directed that project. I was still doing a lot of professional development, and I would, kind of annoy Chuck with my constant refrain of, there's a lot of redundancy out there about textbooks that are being scanned locally and publishers that are complaining, and we should figure out some way within the context of this center to address some of these issues. And so one of the things we had was we had some additional supplemental funds that were held back by the department to be used for maybe special projects. So we proposed that we would convene a group of individuals from all these different, the advocacy groups, from the publishing community and from the consumer groups. We would convene these folks together to see if we could come up with a solution. And that was known affectionately as the National File Format Technical Panel. And we started meeting, I get my dates, around 2002, 2003, maybe 2004, over a period of a year. I think we had 3 meetings, and the goal was to see if we could come up with a solution or at least a proposed solution to the problem that the publishers and the disability advocates and the consumers themselves all shared. Everybody was dealing with the same issue from a different perspective. And I'll never forget one of the first meetings, probably the first meeting we held in Washington of the National File Format Technical Panel. I was sitting at a table. We did some breakout groups with various individuals and experts in various disability areas, and I was seated at a table with 2 folks from National Braille Press who were blind, and 2 folks from the National Association of Learning Disabilities, and some folks from the National Association for the Deaf. We started talking about formats and access, and one of the folks from National Braille Press, who was quite definitive in his opinions, said, look, the answer here is, this is a very simple problem. I don't know why we're all gathered together here. We know exactly what we need in order to solve this problem. What we need is text, and digital text, and text is the answer. And across the table, someone from the National Council of Learning Disabilities said, text is not the answer, text is the problem. That exchange for me was kind of an undeniable affirmation that what was someone's access route was someone else's barrier, and that we needed to create alternatives, multiple alternatives, so that we eliminated as many barriers as we possibly could. Those deliberations over the course of that year, we actually came to resounding agreements. There was a file format and extensible markup language, or XML file format, that was proposed, called DAISY, and that we ended up coming up with a subset of the DAISY extensible markup language XML format that we referred to as National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standard, or NIMAS. And at the time of those deliberations, the agreement as to what the NIMAS consisted of was a voluntary agreement across the publishing community, the advocacy community, and the end user community. And as those voluntary discussions were going on towards the final meetings, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was being reauthorized. And a number of the people in the National File Format Group who were very knowledgeable policy folks realized if they could get a NIMAS mandate into the reauthorization of IDEA and not have to promote the NIMAS specification or standard forward as a separate piece of legislation, that its chances of passing were just accelerated enormously. And so a subset of the National File Format Technical Panel and their advocates lobbied various members of Congress to include the NIMAS language and the NIMAS agreement in IDEA as a mandate. And that created all sorts of subsequent challenges because those folks who had agreed to the format were agreeing to a voluntary format. Now what was being pushed forward was a mandated format. So there were all sorts of kind of side adjustments that needed to be addressed. Copyright law, textbooks contain images and graphs and charts and other elements that publishers contract out to third parties for, so there had to be some mechanism for doing that. There also had to be a clarity as to which students would be eligible to receive these materials so that they weren't distributed kind of willy-nilly to every student and undermine the market model. So there were even though this was the exact right thing to do of pulling what had been a voluntary standard or specification into a mandatory legislative statement for states and districts, it brought with it a range of challenges that needed to be addressed. And so that was the NIMAS portion of the legislation. IDEA resulted in just multiple other meetings and conversations and ultimately cooperations where everybody said, yeah, this is a solvable problem. And it turned out that that was the case.
Skip, as a direct result of CAS's role in the creation of NIMAS and its inclusion in IDEA, you were awarded 2 of the first 3 centers that the Department of Education established to support the implementation of the NIMAS specification. And since then, the department has awarded to CAS 4 consecutive grants related to the provision of accessible materials and technologies. Describe how the work has evolved over time.
I think that in the National File Format Technical Panel meeting was really the crucible for us learning about consensus building. In the first meeting, I was struck by the fact there were probably 35 representatives of stakeholder organizations in the room, many of whom would, under other circumstances, have not agreed to be in the same hotel lobby as one another, and a lot of concern. There were a concern, for example, from a number of the blind advocacy organizations that bringing in the needs of students with learning disabilities, for example, would water down an effort that had been so aggressively and effectively spearheaded by blind and low vision advocates. And yet, on the other hand, we realized that the number of blind students in the country was quite small in terms of thinking about, kind of political power and need, and that there were potentially in the K-12 space 10,000 blind students who needed Braille, and that amount was not going to constitute a market for the commercial publishers, nor was it likely to get their attention in the way that the 2.5 or 2.6 million students with attentional and learning disabilities might. And so it became clear to us that it was important to listen to the concerns of each group and then point out to them that things that were their closely held concerns and beliefs could in fact be magnified by joining together, and that the mantra of better together was the absolute one. And so through the course of the two or three, I think it was three meetings of the National File Format Technical Panel, and the subsequent there were subsequent work groups that were developed out of that, and a lot of ongoing weekly communication among members. It went from being a somewhat abrasive initial meeting. It was like sitting in a room of people made of sandpaper, and they were all rubbing up against each other. And that sandpaper disappeared through the subsequent meetings and through the end of the year. And you could almost you could certainly see it. It was palpable in the room, and as the work kind of wound down, people were saying we need to stay together and make these collaborations persist, because even though this particular task, the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standard, had been addressed and identified, there were other issues. Obviously, copyright was an ongoing issue. How were intellectual property holders, the rights, the individuals who hold the rights to that intellectual property, how were they going to be, how are their materials going to be protected? How are they going to be compensated if some of those materials were being given away for free? What was the balance? In those discussions, I think it was also, on the flip side, was talking to the consumer end and saying that there's an inherent cost in the production, distribution, storage, and cataloging of alternate format accessible materials, and we have to figure out a way to compensate people who are doing that. So just because the need is there, just because it's essential that students have these materials, doesn't mean that they can simply be acquired. There's no cost associated with their production. So how do we address that cost? And that these are, for the most part, private companies that are producing these materials. Are they going to be compelled to do something that's going to affect their bottom line, or can we create an environment where there's a purchasing exchange, there's a trusted relationship between producer and consumer? So I think that we realized early on in that NIMAS was really about collaboration, and it was in many ways it was an eye-opening kind of experience for us at CAST. I remember we used to do annual retreat, so we'd have a day of retreat to get together. CAST as an organization, starting from when we were quite small, of 12 or 15 people, and then continuing through the present day when we're a little more than that. And we would get together and talk about what our vision was and what we were going to invest in the future. And I remember one meeting, probably around the year 2000, as a retreat, where we got together and the issue of education policy arose. Would we ever be involved in education policy? And there was a resounding no, that's not, we don't have any expertise in that. There's nothing that is likely to draw us into that. We're really clinicians. We're interested in research and publishing and presenting and professional development. There's no room in there for policy. And 4 years later, all the work I was doing was educational policy around accessible instructional materials or accessible educational materials. And so it was a profound change for the organization. As David had mentioned, we realized that we could gain through partnerships things that were simply impossible to gain on our own, and that the end benefit was we could take steps towards changing the way the world works with those partnerships, and that those opportunities would likely be denied to us if those partnerships didn't exist, and that the only way for a partnership to be effective was through some sort of consensus building, where you acknowledged that the person you were talking with and needed to support your effort may have a totally different perspective on what was important to them, and that you needed to acknowledge that perspective, incorporate it in some way in the decision making, and then that allowed you to move forward. And that, in fact, was really just an extension of the type of collaborative work that CAST had already committed to within the organization. We were we were committed to collaborative partnership efforts, everything from exploration of new prototypes and research to publication. And so taking that commitment to collaboration externally helped move the work of the organization forward, and persists to this day. That if you look at the work of particularly the AIM Center, there's a sense of trusted intermediary amongst the consumer, the disability advocacy community, the federal government who funds the AIM Center, and the publishing community, where AIM Center decisions and kind of investments have an impact. And so each of those groups has a different end goal in mind, but they're all dealing with the same issues on a day-to-day basis. And it's important enough for the AIM Center to be and CAST to be skilled at consensus building and collaboration.
I just wanted to add one thing that in this regard, I think Skip captured it accurately. There's a great phrase that we used all the time when we were thinking ahead, and the phrase is, "There's nothing you can't accomplish if you don't need the credit." And I think one of the things that we really tried to do was to spread the credit around and to work with people rather than to own it as CAST alone. In fact, one of the tensions with our board was the board wanted us to copyright the term universal design for learning and to own it and so on. Thinking as a commercial matter, it was a sellable thing. And then everybody have to come to us and all that. And we realized, no, actually, we want people, all sorts of people to be invested in universal design for learning. And we knew that a way to kill it and to marginalize it was to say it's CAST. And only CAST does universal design for learning. So we consistently rejected the we need all the credit kind of position. I think that was central to what we've been able to accomplish, is that we didn't ever feel we were doing it alone. I have to say one other thing that came up when Skip was talking. I love that too, that incident. There were a couple of times when the organization shifted completely, and one of them was around the policy thing. Just like he said, we literally put on a board, we don't do policy, because it was like a relief. There's something we don't do. And I was once introduced by Chris Deedy, who's a big educational technology leader at Harvard, and he was introducing me, and he said, David works at CAST. He said, CAST has always struck me as like a junkyard dog. And I was like, oh my God, where is this going? And he said, they've got their teeth around, something, and they just are not going to release it, except if they find a better way, they'll release it in a minute and try that. And I thought it was a good image. So like we were doing okay, but we weren't getting at something central, as Skip was saying. So then we said, okay, we'll do policy then. And I think that was also central to CAS's, continuing, what should I say, viability, was that we would every once in a while go, you know what? And sometimes we're going to actually do things that we didn't think we'd ever do to get a new grip on it. So I like the image of us being a junkyard dog that cooperates with other junkyard dogs.
In part 3, Skip and David reflect on how the history of accessibility at CAST informs the organization's work today. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Accessible Learning Experience, brought to you by the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials at CAST. You can find us on the web at aem.cast.org. There you'll find show notes with links to all of the resources mentioned on each episode. Thanks again for listening, and remember, accessibility is everyone's responsibility. The contents of this podcast were developed under a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of Education. However, those contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the U.S. Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government.